Right.
You don't need God anyway.
And speaking of that, real quick, because I was going to get to that, I wanted to have a few steps in between, but just since you mentioned morality, if you look at so throughout time, ancient civilizations had these law codes, and they always said these laws are from God, pretty much,
Yeah,
almost
almost.
across the board.
Right.
You got the Ur-Nammu law code, you got the law code of Hammurabi, and then you got the Bible, you got the Deuteronomy law code, and then you got the New Testament. You can see a progression from going from, okay, we're going to throw you into the lake, and if you survive, you're innocent, to, okay, we're just going to cut your hand off if you steal, and then to, like, let's be fair, let's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and then finally it's like, well, love your neighbor. Okay, you
Yeah,
see,
but it's interesting that religion had love thy neighbor had a different version of throwing you in the lake when they were talking about witches, which was to throw them in, and if they didn't survive, they were innocent. If they survived, they were guilty. It was a much more efficient way of dealing with people
right,
you want to get rid
which
of.
which tells you that morality comes from, well, I don't know if this is what you think, but I think it's from our experiences. We
Oh, I think it's a number of things. I think there's an evolutionary basis. I think it comes from a rational understanding of the world and the way it can work most efficiently. So I think, there's a famous saying, sort of saying from Hume, I think, which is you can't get an ought from an is. But I think with an is combined with rational thinking leads to oughts pretty darn close in any case. And so I think, it's look, you can simply ask people, and I've done this in public, you know, if if you didn't believe in God, would you go out and murder someone? And most people, say no. Every now and then there's someone who says yes. But obviously we're driven by things that have nothing to do with that belief in God. We innately understand some moral basis which allows us to exist more or less peaceably with our environs. And those things arise out of a tribal culture and they get codified often in a religious jargon because that helps keep the tribes together. But when you think about it, it's just a way of enforcing adherence to a set of rules that make sense for the most part. And they don't always make sense either. Of course, that's the whole point. I mean, the Bible is full of rules that are rather horrible, but most people ignore those and just take the ones they like.
Yeah, and I'm actually having somebody on after you who we're going to talk about the history of science, and I would argue that, like, you hear all the time from, like, people like Jordan Peterson, they'll say, Western civilization would be nothing without the church and Christianity, but it's like, wait a second here. If you go back before the church, you got the Epicureans, you got Democritus, who was talking about atoms. They were on to stuff, and then the church came along, and then it's like they went backwards for 1,000 years. I would argue the opposite.
Well, I think there's a little bit of both. That's the point. It's as usually the case. Sort of extremes or stereotypes are usually just that. And so it's true that the enforcing adherence to religious doctrine by the church held Western civilization back in the early Middle Ages. At the same time, it's also true that that the repositories of books and learning were religious groups, monks, and later on universities. And so, the kind of intellectual climate that involves thinking, reading, writing, and did grow out of the church later on. And of course, eventually those universities grew out of the church. All the early universities were church run. Eventually, they grew out of it. So there's a give and take. Certainly, the existence of Western universities goes back to church-run things, but the existence of ignorance for a few hundred years was among the masses of the public was also due to church-run hierarchy. So it's a combination of good and bad, I think.
And if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it like a Jesuit who discovered the Big Bang or
Well,
theorized it?
yeah, Lemaitre was a Belgian priest, Jesuit priest, but he was also a physicist. He did his PhD at MIT,
Right.
and he was the first one to recognize that the solution of Einstein's equations implied basically that you had an expanding universe that arose from an initial point. And he discovered that he wrote that down around 1928 or 29, which is before Hubble just
Wow.
empirically discovered that the universe was expanding. And certainly Einstein didn't buy into it, and Hubble never bought into it. But eventually people realized that Lemaitre was right. Yeah.
That's
And
fat.
when he did, by the way, the Pope sometime later said, "Hey, this is evidence of Genesis of the," and Lemaitre, who was both a priest and a scientist, said, "No, stop it. This is a scientific theory. You can take it to validate what you want, or you can take it to validate something else, but it's not. It's not. It shouldn't be taken inappropriately."
And that's fascinating. So I've heard you say, I don't know where, I can't remember where I heard you say this. You were talking, it was on some podcast, but you said that the universe at one point was the size of an atom.
Yeah, one of my books called Atom begins at a time when our visible universe was the size of an atom. It was smaller than that at earlier times. But before that, sort of the laws of physics as we understand them break down, so we can't extrapolate backwards with authority in any way. But back to the time when the universe was the size of an atom or so, the laws of physics as we know them allow us to extrapolate back. And it is really amazing. I mean, it's unfathomable to think of all of the energy and matter that's now in the universe in one way or another existing in a region that small. It's just unfathomable. But that's the great thing about the universe and science is it forces you to stretch what you can imagine.
So to go back a little bit, because you were talking about, you said that you don't, when you look around, you don't see anything that points to a designer. However,
In fact, if you ask me, I see all evidence to the contrary.
sure.
We're not designed very well. If we were, we wouldn't have blind spots. We wouldn't breathe out of the same orifice. We eat all sorts of things that if I were going to design a human being, I might design differently. But
And
the
I,
universe in general, it seems completely random. And when you look at it, it's more or less structureless on large scales, and the fluctuations from the Big Bang are what are called Gaussian random fluctuations, which are understandable from quantum mechanics, but don't give any evidence of any initial purpose or design.
Now, I agree with that, but I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. There's this big, I mean, there's in math, there's the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio,
Yeah.
and the New Age movement loves to point to this and say, "Look, it's everywhere. It's in plants. It's everywhere. Look, it's there's God's fingerprint right there. How can you deny it?" That's what they'll
Well,
say.
mathematics describes the world, and mathematics produces patterns. And if the world is describable by mathematics, and the laws of nature are explicable as mathematical laws, then it's not too surprising to find remnants of mathematical truths in what we see in nature. I mean, you could just look. The number two is profoundly important, and it exists throughout nature. But people don't seem to find that as surprising. But binary aspects of the world are all around us, and so yeah, it's fascinating that it's fascinating, but not too surprising that different structures are governed by the same mathematical laws. That's one of the wonderful things about physics. So it's not too surprising to see the same representations crop up in many different places, from galaxies down to living things.